Hi, my name is Morten Elvang. Tonight I'm going to the Business Agility meetup in Berlin online to talk about strategy starts with how, something I'm looking very much forward to. This is my rehearsal, and I don't really know if the meetup tonight is going to be recorded or not. Therefore, maybe I will release this one so I get everybody a chance to listen in. About me, I'm an engineer, been working with large organizations all my life, either as a consultant or as an employer of the organization. And it's been a pretty interesting ride, always being the one to work with how people are working, operational development, organizational design, and lately more around portfolio management and strategy execution, including strategy itself, which is what I will talk about today. And it's been a bit of an odyssey in the last 4 years, starting with consolidating my thoughts on portfolio management, and today leading into a view on what's even going on with strategy. And I wanted to just give you an idea of what I've been doing. It's been sort of steps into different areas of study, like scale agile, lean portfolio management, the Kinefin framework, and infusing the two. My first thought was how to take scale agile framework, LPM, out to play with the Kinefin, and out of this came the idea of collaborative lean portfolio management, which is still very much part of my thinking. Then I got to know about open strategy, the idea of openness as transparency and inclusion. I looped those ideas back to the ideas of Kinefin, the European Field Guide for Crisis Management, and suggested with that new semantics for the ideas of inclusion and transparency. And finally, all of this led me into the broader field of strategy, which is what I'm looking at today. I don't call it agile strategy because by its very nature, no strategy is agile. It's actually almost like an oxymoron. So I think we can just talk about strategy. On the way, lots of presentations, I think more than 100, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity that people have given me to meet them and discuss with them about this. And it's resulted as well in a number of books. They are self-published, and articles in the Danish press and blogs on LinkedIn. So where is strategy today? Well, what you hear is actually not really very rosy. So I think, at least for me, it very much looked like the gap is real. I don't know how you see this, but what I hear often is that actually most people don't really know what strategy is. And in the workshops I have been doing, presentations I've been giving, that very much reflects the reality. When you start talking about what is your strategy, a significant number of people start by saying they don't actually really know. And then, interestingly, when we talk about it, actually, of course, they know something, but it's not something which is immediately present in their mind. Then the sentence on the quality of strategies is also pretty hard. I picked this up from Roger Martin, who said that only 15% of all strategies are useful, which seems to resonate with what I'm seeing. And then finally, there's a lot of talk going on at the moment about how AI can help with strategy. And strategy seems to be one of the areas where there is the least immediate opportunity for artificial intelligence to help, even if it can, of course, help with many things around the strategy process itself, like it can with almost anything you can imagine. But by and large, from what I hear, it's still your job to figure out what to do with strategy. Your chatbots are not going to fix this one for you. Then there's another aspect that you hear if you listen, is that the risk is real. And I have personally been experimenting with asking people in workshops what's the level of disaster they have been part of. And I would say almost everyone, with a rare exception, have somehow experienced catastrophic economic failure or even bankruptcy. And my conclusion is that most of us throughout the span of our career will experience something like this at least once, which means, back of a napkin drawing, that within the 40 years a normal career spans, at least once you will experience something like this, which means that there is a not insignificant probability of this actually happening in the place where you are. Also, just from listening to what people say, it seems to have been like this for decades, and it begs the question of what's really going on here. And then also, to the nature of our talk today, what is actually changing about the situation of strategy, or what needs to change around the situation of strategy. So what's going on with strategy? Well, it's a thing. I think it's been popular in the business literature for the past 30 to 40 years, when people started talking about it: corporate strategy, competitive strategy, all of that. And in a corporate setting, it's very much about coming from an idea, a vision, into some tangible action that will lead to great results. So it's very much like a translation thing, translating the vision, the mission, the ideas, even the purpose, into something you can actually do that will deliver result. And as we talked about, there are these significant gaps: the knowing, doing gap, and the strategy execution gap. So what I believe personally that saves the larger organization is what I call the black market of common sense, is that organizations are full of super smart people, and when information is missing, they fill out the blanks and do sensible things that actually save the day and produce solid economic results in the short term, even if it was based on missing or inadequate guidance from things like strategies and central planning, etc., etc. So what this simple, and you often hear about this as well. So I'm basically now talking about what I often hear. Obviously, it resonates with the things I'm seeing: lack of transparency, often coming from trying to do too many things, frustration of not feeling heard, signals drowning in noise, the change increasing speed, which means that it's increasingly difficult to keep up. And then finally, about the new things, artificial intelligence, generative AI, broadly the process of digitizing work, where there is a bit of dilemma, is that work as we know it is not how we would like to see it in the digital form. So this represents a bit of a catch-22 for many organizations. So the problem manifests in speed, cost, and risk. The gap is real. The gap is not the problem in itself, but the problem is that because of the gap, you lack the coordination to change rapidly when things are changing. So you can basically say that to realign, you need to be aligned in the first place, or to rebalance, you need to be in balance, which is almost a bit of a paradox. Sometimes I call this the alignment paradox, which results in lack of competitiveness in the worst cases. The risk is still real, and increasingly, I would say it's unaffordable, meaning that it's not really sustainable to operate at the risk levels that some organizations seem to do. So that in itself is a problem. Lack of coordination to high risk exposure is not a nice cocktail. And obviously, I don't really know what's going on in your company. And I have been in a few companies myself. So I would say that this picture is not unreal. Obviously, in each and every company, everybody is doing every day what they think is the best thing to do. So the question here is more, is there actually anything changing around strategy that should cause us to think differently about it and apply it differently in our work? This is not in any way meant as a criticism of what a specific company is doing. Let's try to reset a bit and go back over some of the logic from a different perspective. What I will argue is that the dominating context for strategy is changing. So the world you see yourself in when you do strategy is changing. Traditionally, it has been so that it's a pretty solid world. If you swing the hammer, you can count on it hitting the nail. Strategy is about defining position and showing direction. Less so today, where things are just going a bit faster and surprises are coming more often, which requires a bit more liquidity, meaning fluidity and capacity to deal with change when it's happening. So in this context, it's more about absorbing surprises and bringing steer to the situation, which basically means that strategy is changing role from being a North Star tool to being more of a navigational compass, if not a mirror helping you to reflect on the situation that you're in currently. Also worth just noting that 2025 is the year of collaboration. And I would suggest that without a meaningful idea of strategy, you just cannot usefully collaborate. Why is collaboration interesting? Well, we actually would like to have organizations which are more open and self-managing, able to make their own decisions, network-based, connection-based, etc., which is literally collaborative organizations. They are formed by the things people are doing. And since action is not driven by command, but actually formed on collaborations, the idea of strategy becomes even more important as a coordination tool. If you think about it, strategy actually is the highest level of planning and coordination in any context. So what does strategy actually look like? Well, in its new form, I would say you can think of it as aspiration and action. Earlier, aspiration came from the vision, the action was in what you plan to do. But now it's more like a combination where you cannot afford the aspiration and the action to not be connected. They are forming the choices you make as they are formed by the choices you make. So the strategy itself is an object of change like anything else around you. It still needs to be the representation of what you do, even a projection of your identity, so that what you aspire to do and what you actually do is expressed through the strategy that you're operating. And then it has a number of characteristics inspired by Playing to Win by Roger Martin and his co-author. Winning aspiration, where to play, that's the aspiration. How to win, that's the action. Then you really want strategy to be significant. You want it to solve your biggest problems, to have relevant impact. You want it to be useful choices or clear choices, meaning that when you choose something, the opposite must make sense. Being the best in the world is not a choice. Its opposite is not really something anybody would want to be, the worst in the world. But going for young people in the low end of the market is a choice, because you could have chosen to go for elderly people in the upper end of the market, is an example. So by the choice you make, you actually exclude other options. Some people say that strategy is all about deciding what not to do, which also makes sense in this context. And then finally, it's got to be useful for the navigation. Whenever you need to change your mind, it's going to be helpful in the process of doing that. What is good strategy? Well, it's actually easier to see what bad strategy is. So bad strategy is typically when you have lack of coordination, etc., and you see a lot of dysfunctions. But even in the absence of those, I think you can only conclude finally on whether strategy is good or not when you see the outcomes of it. Was it useful in guiding your action? Was it precise in pointing out what value to aspire to harvest? Then you can start talking about good strategy. And really what it does in a dynamic context, and this one I got from Graham Kenny in one of the recent Agile strategy meetups, is that it wants to answer the question of how do we work the situation to our advantage, which, even if the question stands, is a constantly changing thing in today's turbulent world. And what triggers the turbulence is pretty much what you can call surprises. So change will surface in your context as some element of surprise. So it might be interesting to just look at what surprise looks like. And I think you can see three kinds of surprises which are overlapping, and in many ways it doesn't really matter what type a surprise is. I still think it's interesting for us to just understand the three different types. So the bubbles are the ones that creep on you. It might be the big project which is not really going well and you kind of know it, but one day it blows in your face and you realize, actually, this is not going well. The bubble burst. Then there is the flash, the rain on a summer day. If you had known it would start to rain, you would have brought your umbrella or stayed home. But as it starts to rain, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just to enjoy the rain. No matter what you do, you will get wet. And then finally, the stroke of serendipity, which is a bit like a green rabbit you notice in the office jumping around and disturbing you, which also comes to you and often carries some positive upside if you decide to go with it. The thing about the flash is that it's like unknowable and it's pretty hard to ignore. The bubble is actually knowable. That's by its nature. It's growing slowly, but probably also sometimes too easy to ignore until it blows in your face and actually becomes a bit of a lightning in itself. And then the green rabbit, the opportunity, stroke of serendipity, that's also actually unknowable. Even if it's your own idea, you wouldn't know this idea before you surprise yourself with it. Still, it's rather easy to ignore. But the thing is that once you get to know it, or once you ignore it, you actually know it, which can lead to a bit of agony and self-pity later when you realize that you should have been doing things differently. Then you can take it a bit step further and say that really what is going on is that we have our aspiration action and they cause reaction. And in the mix of this, you not only see surprises, but you also feel tensions. I mean, at work, we have people hired to be tense with each other, the product owner, the scrum master, the HR person, the CFO. So it's in the tension that you find the balance. So that basically also means that by monitoring the tension and surprise, you find the source of steerability in the modern organization, which is what makes this so important. Then we can look back at the idea of strategy, and strategy actually in itself is a bit of a wild problem. So it's not easy always to define what it is, and the solution will keep changing as time goes on and the context is changing. So you can see this as a constant triangulation between your visual reality and the opportunities that present themselves, the options that you have. That out of this is where you need to figure out what's the best move in the moment out of your viable possible options. And looking a little bit back at Darwin, you can say that the future belongs to those who best absorb and prosper from the unexpected. And also, it's important that this is not actually a rational process. Very often, ideas for clever things to do comes as a hunch, and then later you can validate with data, etc., until the data confess. You can say with a smiley and validate that the idea is pretty good and solid to go with. But the process of getting the idea is not a rational process. So looking at strategy, how can we work the situation to our advantage? Well, actually pretty much around strategy is what you already know. Playing to win is is my preferred framework to explaining that process, that you go over your logic again and again and again until you get a clear idea of your aspiration and how to win, supported by your capabilities and the systems and the wider context you're in. And then most importantly, it's a matter of being able to change your choice freely when better opportunity presents itself. With that, we can actually look back and say, what do we really want from strategy? What are the things which are important? And I think there are 6 things which stand out for what I would call contemporary strategy. One is that it's actionable. It means that it helps you make choices. It's responsive, so it helps you actually change your choices when presented with more favorable options. It's reflective. It serves as a compass or a mirror. So when you look at your strategy, when you look at your situation, it helps you understand if you are actually still on the best possible trajectory or if you should change your mind on some important parameters. Sorry. So the 3 others are distinctive. So it means that it needs to be offering you a really relevant advantage. In competitive terms, protecting your position. In commercial terms, differentiating your offers from competitors. All the product part of things. Transformative, meaning that it's not only driving your choice, but it's also driving who you influence, your context, try to change your environment to be more favorable towards what you want to try and achieve. And then finally, and this is a more interesting one, is that it's also integrative. So if you think of strategy now becoming aspiration action, they can actually be observed in any context, but they need to be sensibly integrated with the wider context. So basically, in your team, you can do whatever you want, follow whatever strategy you want, as long as it usefully contributes to the wider organization, and you're not unduly harming other in their aspiration to contribute by the actions that you are taking. Which leads us back to the how. So how about the how, which was the title of the presentation. And I'm very much inspired by something that Dave Snowden said. I picked it up from a presentation. I think his literal words were something like avoidance of failure is better than replication of poor practice. I have elaborated a bit on that, and I would say that avoidance of failure is more important than drive for value. Rather than win today, it's more important that you actually survive the day and can play for another win tomorrow, which plays on the idea of options theory. And if you remember back to our discussion of risk, it also challenges why do you take risks that can bring you at the risk of bankruptcy or disastrous economic failure. You've got to find a way of somehow limit that risk appetite to something more affordable. And that leads to suggestion for a few strategy words for 2025 or the near future. So one is reactionable. When you learn something new, you've got to be able to capitalize on it. In the criteria, I called it responsive. It's about tension. So it's really sort of in the tension, in the conflicts, in the dilemmas, in the deviations from the expected that you have the steer. And then finally, this idea of implied strategy to constantly tack yourself onto the next useful thing as a way of progressing towards a more desirable future. It has strong links to 2 things from lean thinking. One is a theory of constraint, the idea of inherent simplicity, and the other is Toyota Kata, as Mike Ruther has been preaching for a while. This idea of always looking at the next thing to do, towards your anticipation of a more favorable future. And this we can put together in a framework where you look at the problem you want to solve, the implied strategy, and then constantly reworking those based on the surprises that you are facing, working with monitoring tensions, outlining your options and making choices, and basically leveraging from opportunity coming your way, playing on the variables which are significant for your business. And if you go back to the golden circle, the famous why, how, what, where you start with the why, you could argue that as disruption shifts from low intensity to high intensity, traveling east in the picture I showed earlier, which is inspired by the Cynefin model, you can say that it actually triggers a phase shift from the solid role and responsibility-based organizations to the more liquid value and opportunity-based organization. And in that world, the circle would look like this. You could call it the equal circle, which, assuming the purpose, actually starts with the how. And researchers in the business area have suggested that purpose actually becomes a little bit like your mission, vision, etc. So all of that gets folded into your aspiration that guides your action, which in turn guides your aspiration. So how you do that becomes more important than the what and the why, which means that approach is more important. So the tricks, if you want to get started with this, well, I talk about staying on strategy. So if you have a strategy, use it. If you don't have one, figure out what it is and use it. I call that staying on strategy. Then you need to reconfigure your collaborations to work around it usefully. You could think of it as balancing acts. There are basically three. One is to figure out what strategy you want to follow. One is to make sure you have the muscles to lift the ambitions you have been taking on. And the last one is like the real balancing act of making sure that intent and contribution meets usefully for the ambition you have taken on with the capabilities you have to deliver on that ambition. Then you've got to keep an eye on where you're falling short, which is interesting. If some of you are familiar with the Kano model, then very often we are looking in the upper right corner for opportunities to create excitement for the customer. In a starting point, most organizations would actually have bigger potential benefits by looking at the pain spectrum, expectations which are unmet or undetected at the moment, and simply just catch up on a rather minimum level of meeting all the expectations, which a little bit resonates with the idea of not running too big risks and try to limit the risks by operating at a minimum level of performance. And then finally, your ability to change your choices when opportunity emerge. You don't actually have to do this every day, but like one of my friends said, you've got to practice it every day because otherwise you will not be ready like many other things. So you've got to find this rhythm where you're constantly looking at what's changing. And even if nothing is changing, you will still keep looking and just mini adjusting to whatever makes sense to stay on that strategy. So unmiss, unfilter, unlock is something I often talk about as the here and now opportunity in getting onto a better trajectory. And in that process, actually getting yourself on strategy and staying on strategy. Interestingly, strategy has not really been a big part of what we have done in Agile so far. So if you look at this picture, which I'm a big fan of and have been following for many years, not super excited about everything I have seen, but I actually think it's a pretty good framework for doing Agile at scale. But where is the strategy? So my proposal is that we actually need to advocate that it really gets in to the framework with this ambition on staying on strategy and leading with strategy. And I even believe that this would be a way to further evolve the framework from the very solid standing into something more liquid, driven by value and opportunity. And there is a path, which is what I have been researching now for a couple of years. Today we are able to demonstrate this in a workshop. It could be a Scaled Agile Framework workshop. And I have now the third, if not fourth, iteration out on adding useful words to what's going on, which I just published as what I call the strategy playbook, which basically introduces you to the concept of staying on strategy and managing surprise, and serves as a companion to the workshop itself. And if you look at it, then the steps to introduce it are quite tangible. I'm not saying this is what you should do, but this shows one viable path to get there, where what you would do is that you would simply start by mapping your ecosystem, understanding where pain is coming from. The biggest pain is your biggest problem. Make a strategy. Of course, make sure that the pain doesn't get worse. You start launching a number of collaborations, the ones I talked about, or the balancing acts, finding out what problem to solve, double checking that you actually have the muscle to deal with it, and then starting the process of balancing the activities which are aiming to solve the problem so they usefully collaborate with each other. The first tack, you could say, would be to settle on the implied strategy, which is the part of the problem you want to start by solving. Going over your collaborative structure, making sure it's useful, and then shift your focus to value-adding actions at affordable risk as you pursue solving that problem. Then, in the process of staying on strategy, what you really would do is that you would anchor on these balancing acts on an ongoing basis, and in that find like a new normal, and then rebuild the rest of your organization around that. It's a little bit of a longer story, but I put the details in the book. It also requires a semantic notion of portfolios for everything to add up, and you can explain how it works on the back of Kotter's dual operating model from the book Accelerate. So here's like a time-wise view. Some of you know from the PI planning that there is this pivotal moment where all the teams have presented and senior managers present for the first time say, oh, wow, that's the best overview I've ever got. We play on some of the same mechanisms. And what we have found is that in starting this, just making things visible in the process of doing that, the unmessing, unfiltering process, a lot of activities get challenged and can basically be parked or completely stopped, which immediately free up more capacity and increases transparency, etc., to start getting you in the right direction. The gap is real. There are things we can do. Thank you. And if you're interested in helping me review the book, please ping me for a review copy. I would be very interested to hear your comments. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the meetup tonight. Maybe this is how you will meet me. Bye for now.